5 mixing mistakes I see way too often. Hi, welcome to the Crates Motel. My name's Conan. In today's video, I want to go over 5 errors that I see just a little bit too often from students, from people that I teach online, and on some of the mixes I get sent as a mastering engineer. But they're not that difficult to fix. So let's jump in. So here we are in Studio One. Now, I'm not going to go over these errors in massive detail. I'm going to kind of skim through them. But I just want to kind of illustrate some of these errors and just how easy it is to fix them. Now, the first one I'm going to go through is high passing. Now, I do see online quite a lot of people saying that you should just high pass everything. Now, I get the reasoning behind that because a lot of low-end information on instruments can muddy up a mix and can create problems in mixing. It can eat up a lot of your headroom. So whilst high passing as a rule is not a bad thing, I don't think that you should do anything by default. So just putting a high pass on every single one of your instruments and setting a particular frequency on each one of your instruments, for me personally, is a bad thing to do. So let's just illustrate that quickly with some drum beats. Now, if we take an EDM drum beat, a 909, now I can tell you that each one of these elements, the kick, the clap and the hat, have a high pass filter on them at 80 Hertz. Straight away, if you're listening on headphones, you can hear that there's not a lot of bottom end to it. And I know if I roll back the kick drum, around about 20 Hertz is probably where I would normally have it on a kick drum, on a 909 kick drum. You can hear suddenly that there's bottom end there. So obviously straight away I've illustrated that if you throw a high pass filter on all of your tracks, you're going to lose bottom end, especially on the kick. But it doesn't just end there. If we go to the clap, now generally getting rid of 80 Hertz is not a bad thing with a clap. You can even see from the signal there isn't really any information below 110 Hertz. That's pretty common for a 909 clap, to be honest. But because of the slopes that you'll set up, if you start dialing in too high up, like for instance I've taken it to 110 Hertz roughly, around about there, but you can see the slope is going to be starting to cut some of the signal from kind of 300-400 Hertz. So that's why you need to listen to, when you high pass, you need to listen in context. Don't do things in solo. And especially with snares and claps, sorry, a lot of the body to the information is around about 110 Hertz up to around about 200 Hertz. So whilst you might not be able to really hear it in solo, you will hear it in context. So whilst I can push this all the way up to 500, 600 Hertz, and it still doesn't sound that bad, to be honest, you're losing some of the body to the clap. Now this is going to be easier to illustrate in a snare drum, which I'll do in a second. And the same with hats. You can see on this 909 hat that there's a lot of information down here. Round about there, obviously that's quite extreme. It starts sounding weak and you start losing a little bit of body, which is actually quite nice in hi-hats, especially with EDM. So I probably would high pass up to around about 150. But in context, pushing it up any further, it starts losing a bit of girth, a bit of weight to the hi-hat. And that is why you shouldn't do anything by default, because every single hi-hat, clap, kick is going to be different. It's going to have different information in the low end. It's going to start sounding thinner in different places. The body's going to be in slightly different places. So if you high pass anything by default at a certain frequency, looking at frequency charts, for instance, I'm not a big fan of those for that reason. every single sound that you EQ is going to be different, and is also going to sound different in context. For instance, this hi-hat that I've rolled off at 170 here, I'm going to take that back to about 150. Everything sounds nice and balanced to me, but in a different track with a different drum beat, that 909 hat might sound terrible rolled off at 139, and you might need to actually bring it up to 280, 300. So I guess what I'm trying to say is there's nothing wrong with high passing. It's a really, really useful tool for cleaning up, especially with vocals and with guitars and with live acoustic instruments. But don't do anything by default. So just to illustrate that quickly, with this live drum beat, again, everything's rolled off at 80 Hertz. But with the kick drum here, anything below about 44.5, well, I'm being exact here, 44.5, but let's say around about 40, you don't really need that information when I'm listening in context. It's not so necessary for this live drum beat to have that bottom end. So if I'd have put a high pass in by default, I wouldn't have seen that. And moving on to the snare, again, the snare is going to be different. A live snare will be different from a snare that you've sampled or has been given to you in a sample pack or off a 909 or a drum machine. Because it's organic, its frequency range lies in a different place. Its body's going to lie in a different place. The high end, the low end, they're all going to be different. And that's why doing anything by default just doesn't really work. You can see on this live snare that a lot of information is around about here, which is where the body is. It starts sounding weak if I take away too much of the bottom. I'm just going to take the overheads out here so you can hear a little bit easier. You see, it just sounds thin. You need that bottom end. So you've got rid of some of the information that you don't need, some of the rumble that you might be getting from the microphone. But you don't want to push it all the way up like some people tell you to. And again, I reiterate, that's why you shouldn't do anything by default or follow frequency charts, because this snare drum will be completely different from another snare drum and every other snare drum. In fact, this snare drum will sound different on a different day with a different microphone in a different room. So I can't even apply a preset to this snare drum because it's always going to sound different. So I hope that illustrates why you shouldn't high pass by default, and certainly not high pass at a particular frequency by default. So the next mistake that I see quite a lot is EQing just for the sake of EQing. Now, we all love our plugins. We all love having 150, 300, 800, 1 million different EQs. And sometimes we've got a new EQ and it's a nice looking analog EQ and we think, oh, I need to put that on my kick drum. I need to put this on my guitar. You don't. EQing is necessary, but really, certainly nowadays with a lot of sample packs that we get, I mean, I'm talking about electronic music here obviously, and synths and loop packs that people use and drum machines, most of them have already been EQ'd and compressed. So you don't actually really need to EQ and compress them. So again, don't do anything by default. Don't throw in a load of EQs on a drum beat that you've made up from a drum machine or from a sample pack or even live in the studio. Listen to the information that you have. then make a decision on whether it needs to be EQ'd. Does it need surgical EQ to clean up the signal? Does it need some EQ to enhance the signal? But they're decisions that you should make individually on each signal that you have, each source that you have. Don't just immediately assume that you need to EQ because you've seen people do it, or that you've got the latest new EQ or the latest channel strip, or you've seen somebody in front of a mixing desk twiddling knobs. Most of the time they're doing that for effect for the video camera. You don't actually need to EQ everything. There's reasons why you need to EQ, like I said, for surgical reasons or to enhance, or to find some space in the frequency range. You may need to EQ particular frequencies out to make room for a vocal, or to make room for a guitar lead, or to make room for a rhythm guitar. But they're all individual choices that you make depending on the source. Don't immediately assume that you need to EQ something because you've got EQs built into your DAW, or because you saw somebody do it on a particular guitar or vocal or drum beat. I guess I'm basically saying you don't need to EQ everything. Take everything as it is, listen to it in context, then make the decisions on the EQ that you need to do. And the next one kind of follows on from that in terms of doing something that you don't necessarily need to do, and that is compression. Again, it's one of those things, we have a ton of plugins that look really, really nice. They emulate analog compressors. We've seen all these walls of different compressors in people's studios that still use outboard gear, and we think, if I compress, I'm going to be able to make my track sound like their track. Well, yeah, you can, but only if you know what you're doing with compressors. And the problem is that a lot of people don't really know how to compress properly. So firstly, you need to learn how to compress. Then you're going to know whether you're over compressing or not. One thing I try and teach people when I teach people online, or students, or even if I'm just having a discussion with people, is learn to hear compression. And when you learn to hear compression, then you're going to know if something's over compressed or not. And once you start hearing over compression, it's kind of a bit of a curse in a way, because you kind of want to unhear it, because suddenly you'll listen to something on the radio, or you'll listen to a track and you'll be, oh my God, I can hear the over compression. And it's done way too often. And especially now that we have a lot of people working in the box and you have unlimited compressors that you can over compress very, very easily. It's very tempting to put a compressor on something where you don't actually need to. So going back to what I said about EQ, individually listen to your source and make the decision on whether it needs to be compressed, and then decide what compressor you need to use and how you want to compress it. So as an example, let's use a mix bus compression. We will put a SSL G bus compressor on there. This is a pretty standard compressor, as I'm sure you all know, that gets used on mix buses. But I just want to illustrate over compression. So let's just open up the 909, put some congos and some shakers on there. So let's just listen to that quickly. And you can see already there's a little bit of compression going on. Obviously I'm going to be using mix bus style of compression to illustrate this, but you know, there's different compressors and different styles of compression for individual instruments, for buses, for different situations. But I just kind of wanted to illustrate a good way of learning to hear compression so that you don't over compress. So at the moment I'm just tickling the compressor, just kind of giving that mix bus compression, that kind of glue. But because it's only very, very subtle, I can't really tell what the attack and what the release are doing to the actual signal. But if I push it a little bit further, now I can really hear the effect that the attack and the release are having. And this is a technique that I use to dial in compressors. I will push the threshold a lot further than I actually need to, so I can hear what the attack and release are doing, dial in the attack and release, and then I'll bring the threshold back. So by changing the attack here, you can hear with a really quick attack, I've completely got rid of the transients of the drum beat, which which is obviously something you generally don't want to do with mixed bus compression. It's a really useful sound to get sometimes on particular sources. And by taking the threshold all the way back and really pushing the compression and the gain reduction, I can hear what the attack and release are doing. So I'd make the decision there that that attack's too much. And around about 10, 30 and 30 is when I start getting the transients back. And we can do the same with the release. With a longer release time, it's going to give me more level, but it's not going to be as punchy. And this is why the SSL standard sort of way of setting it up is to have it like this, because you get a lot of punch. You get your transients with the slower attack and you get the punch with the quick release. But if I want it a bit more level, less punch, I could go to around there, around about there. And that would be a really subtle compression. But you can see the technique that I use by using this threshold to really push how the compressor's working, that you can dial in the attack and release a lot easier, and then you're less likely to overcompress, because once you've got it dialed in how you want it and you've got control of the attack and the compression and the transients and the release, then you can bring the threshold back to where you really need it. I mean, a good rule of thumb, especially for mixed bus, for instance, is as soon as you can start hearing it not really do anything, take it back a little bit more, just so it's doing a little bit of something. I mean, that doesn't always work, but it's a pretty good rule of thumb. So I hope I've illustrated with that technique how you can reduce the amount of over-compressing that you do. Another really quick way of not over-compressing is not putting a compressor on at all. That's a decision that you have to make creatively. I guess what I'm trying to say here is that you don't always need compression, but if you do need compression, just be careful not to over-compress unless it's something that you're doing creatively. So the next mistake that I see quite often when I'm working with students one-to-one is mixing with your eyes rather than with your ears. And I'm sure you know what I mean by that, especially when you're working in the box. It's very easy to look at what's happening on the screen, but not really listen with your ears. You make creative decisions by what the fancy lights are doing, what the graphics are doing on the GUI, that kind of thing. And it's really not a good habit to get into because they can be very, very misleading. Now, there's nothing wrong with using your eyes sometimes, especially watching meters. You have to keep an eye on LUFS, that kind of thing. There's nothing wrong with doing it, but don't rely on it and don't use your eyes to make creative decisions if you can help it. Really, you want to be using your ears. So it's a really easy trick that I'm sure you've heard people do before. Shut your eyes. It's as simple as that. Turn away from the screen. You know, have the mouse on the knob that you want to adjust. Close your eyes, make those adjustments. Assign the knobs to a MIDI controller, make the adjustments there. I mean, I use a Presonus Faderport which has a link button on it, which basically enables me to put the mouse over any knob or fader on anything in Presonus or any third-party plugin. And once I leave the mouse over that, I can adjust it on the Faderport with my eyes closed. So it's a lot more hands-on and it's a lot easier to make decisions just using my ears and not having to look at the screen. It's just a really, really good habit to get into. Trust your ears, you know, you really want to trust your ears. Double check it afterwards with your eyes by all means. I sometimes find that I use my eyes a lot more towards the end of the day when my ears are tired, I'm on a deadline, so I need to get something finished. But I know that my ears are probably not hearing above 12K anymore, so I'll use my eyes to look at the signal, look what it's doing above 12K, and I might make some little adjustments on my eyes. But I do, as a rule, try and rely 100% on my ears. Okay, let's say 95% at the end of the day. But I try and make all my creative decisions just using my ears and turning away from the screen. It's just not a good habit to get into, to make your decisions just by looking at the screen and what the graphics are doing and what's going on the screen. The last mistake that I want to go over today very quickly is level matching. And I'm going to go on to just quickly as well, bouncing a rough mix, that kind of thing. But it's all tied into level matching and using references. It's really important when you're using plugins in the box to level match. I'm going to show you quickly why. Let's just bring up the G bus again on the mix bus. So let's just say I've just loaded this in and I hit play. And I immediately think, yeah, that sounds brilliant. Let's take it out. Oh yeah, it just sounds way better with the compressor. It's rocking, it's like really banging. Yeah, love that with the compressor. And then I move on because I've dialed in the compressor and it sounds brilliant. But really, I haven't really actually done that much. I'm being fooled by the fact that it's louder and I haven't level matched properly. So you really do need to try and level match so you can really hear what it's actually doing to the signal. Now, if I level match this, apart from a little bit of work on the transients, it's not actually doing that much to the signal. And because I'm listening in headphones, I can hear the very small amount of compression that it's doing, and it's just really taming the transients a little bit, and it's just kind of creating a little bit of movement, but it's not really actually doing that much. Had I left it up, I would have thought my amazing compression had just made the track sound incredible, and now it's kicking and it's rocking and everyone's going to love it. But really, I haven't actually done that much at all. That's a very quick explanation and example of the fact that if you don't A/B properly, you don't level match properly, you are going to be completely fooled by your plugins. So it's a really good habit to get into, to level match. Just get used to doing it. You know, it's not difficult to do. Just bring the makeup down. And by all means, once you've got it dialed in, you can gain stage a bit if you like, and you can bring the makeup gain up. But at that point, you know what the plugin has done to the signal. So it's been a creative decision, you've made your decision, now you can bring the volume up if you choose. But this also goes on to, you know, when you start a mix, a really good habit to get into is to bounce a rough mix. So you've got maybe the levels all right, it's just a rough mix. So bounce that, stick it on a spare track. I have a track called New Track, which I always have on any of my templates. You could just have the rough mix on there and make sure you're level matching, obviously, like I said. But as the mix progresses, you can go back to listen to where you started. So you can hear, most of the time, hopefully, you're going to think, oh, wow, this is the stuff that I've done, it sounds much better. But also what does happen sometimes, and it happens to me and it happens to people that have been mixing for 50 years, they'll start piling a load of processing on it, and compressors and EQs. They think that it sounds great. They go back to the rough mix and what they've done just sounds rubbish. And having a rough mix there to give you an idea of how far you've come or how backwards you've gone, it's just a really good habit to get into. I love the rough mix. It was something that obviously it's a lot easier to do since we're in the box. There's no reason why you shouldn't do it in the box. You literally just bounce a rough mix and it's there for you to A/B and reference. So there you have it. That's a quick explanation of some of the errors that I see from my students, from people that I work with on a one-to-one basis, and on some of the mixes that I get sent as a mastering engineer. So just to summarize, don't high pass everything by default. In fact, don't do anything by default. Don't EQ unless you need to. Don't overcompress. Use your ears, not your eyes, and level match. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe for more mixing and mastering tutorials and reviews. This is the Crates Motel. My name's Conan. Until next time.